Good morning. How y'all doing? Hopefully everybody is having a good week so far. Still early in the week, but goodness. Another day. And that's the little things for me anymore. So my kiddos showed me tons of love this morning when they woke up. That's all it takes some days to, no matter how tired you are when you wake up, they make your day bright. Or they make your day not so bright, depending on their mood. So it's a good day. All right, let's go ahead and get rolling here. We are going to continue our thought process on the respiratory system. I'm going to go and pick up the speed a little bit today. You guys be ready. Yesterday, we talked about the 4 processes of respiration. In other words, what are the major functions of the respiratory system? Okay, everybody take a deep breath in. The first thing that has to happen when you inhale is ventilation. Ventilation is that physical process of changing your body, right? Changing something in your body that's going to allow for those lungs to draw air in. And then when you exhale, you're going to have a physical change as well. So the conduction of air or airflow is going to be a critical part of what you guys are going to learn about. The good news about airflow is you guys already have a pretty good background in flow period, where you know that flow is proportional to delta P, which is the pressure gradient, all over resistance, where air through a tube requires pressures to be able to move from an area of high to low. So everybody do this again and think about what I just said. Take a deep breath in. What direction did air just flow? Just help me. Use the words environment versus lungs. That works just fine. Air just flowed from where to where? Just making you guys think about it, like I always do. So if it comes from the environment and into the lungs, where do we know pressure must be greater? In the environment or in your lungs? And I hope that makes sense, because air is going to be flowing from high to low. Now everybody breathe out. Air just flowed from your lungs to the environment. Therefore, what just happened to that pressure gradient? It just flipped. Does that make sense? Now pressure is greater in your lungs relative to the environment around you. So how did that happen? Everybody breathe in. What just happened to your thoracic cavity volume? Increase, decrease, no change. The volume of your thoracic cavity just increased. We're going to go through the processes on how that's going to change your lung volume and how this applies with a little bit of physics. But what's going to happen as you increase that volume inside of that chamber, air is going to flow from the environment into your lungs. Do you think you're changing the environmental air pressure? Or are you changing your thoracic cavity pressures? Of course you're changing your thoracic cavity pressures. The air pressure around you remains constant. And as you change your thoracic cavity pressures relative to the air around you, air can flow in or air can flow out. Does that make sense? And it's all going to relate back to that thoracic cavity volume. It's a pretty cool relationship. We can think about the, chambers and balloons and stuff like that in terms of our analogy, and we'll get there today. Cool. It's always being opposed by resistance. No problem. You guys already know the major factors that cause resistance. We'll talk about a couple other factors that might cause resistance in the respiratory system. We got to add some things to our equation. All right, cool. So the other processes, we should be able to at least get started today as well. Just because we have ventilation doesn't mean we have respiration. How did I define respiration yesterday? What is the definition of respiration? Nodding my head, waiting for more answers. Dancing. Whoop, whoop. Awesome. The definition of respiration is gas exchange. And what two locations do we have gas exchange? We don't have gas exchange just in one place. What two locations do we have gas exchange? Where do we find respiration? Okay, cool. Got a few different answers, but pretty much they're all following the same track. Is that gas exchange occurs, one, between the alveoli and the pulmonary capillaries, and two, between the systemic capillaries and whatever tissues that they're talking to. Does that make sense? So, like Andy's answer is great. It's always related to capillaries, absolutely. But we have to think that there are two different capillary beds that we're dealing with. One is in the pulmonary circuit and the other one's in the systemic circuit. Is that clear to everybody? I think so. Cool. Awesome. So the first place we have respiration is in the alveoli. We call that alveolar respiration. Then it gets into the bloodstream, at which point it's nonpolar. It can't just magically get from point A to point B. It needs a carrier protein. So we're going to discuss that carrier protein more. Hemoglobin, we've already started that discussion in Unit 1. We need to discuss it more here in Unit 3. Once it gets out to those tissues, now we're going to have cellular respiration, which is respiration between the systemic circuit and the cells found in the tissues. Then we reverse that process. And we need to talk about getting CO2 back out. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. You guys are going to follow that, no problem. CO2 is nonpolar as well. And we don't have quite the ability to bind CO2 the same way that we bind oxygen. So you're going to find that CO2 transport out of the body is a lot more complex than O2 transport. We're going to eventually get that CO2 back to the lungs, back to the pulmonary circuit, and then you breathe out. We're going to be removing that CO2 from the body. So you can see it's, it's a cycle. Ventilation to cellular respiration, back to ventilation again. Everybody feel comfortable with what we're about ready to go through at record pace? Awesome. So let's get started with ventilation. Let's describe ventilation a little bit better. Okay, ventilation can be defined as the physical act of breathing. There's going to be a lot that goes on in the physical act of breathing. For instance, we're going to have to talk about a nervous system that helps to control ventilation. We'll get to that later, but something you guys can start to think about right now is that most of your life, do you think about breathing? It's a weird question. Most of us never, I mean, I never thought about it before I took a physiology class. I was like, oh, damn. When I tell you to take a deep breath in, then you think about it. Yeah, yoga, meditation, you know, those sorts of things are all designed about thinking about your breathing. Everything you do. But most of the time, ventilation is passive. Even when you're exercising, your ventilation just increases. You don't have a lot of control over it. Can you take over and breathe? Absolutely. So we'll get back to those nervous system controls of ventilation. They're really cool. They have to do with every stimulus in the human body has a receptor, and then that receptor is going to activate, and it's going to create action potentials that result in a response. You guys know the drill, right? It's no different than everything else that we've ever done. But ventilation is mostly about forcing air in and out of our lungs. And this equation is defined by flow. So we're just going to go ahead and draw our little arrow here, and we're going to say we have flow. Ventilation is the physical act of breathing, and what it's going to create is airflow. And we know something about flow already. I hope you guys are just like, yeah, we know, Dr. H. I hope this is boring to you, because that means that you guys have learned. Flow is proportional to a pressure gradient, and it's always opposed by resistance inside of those tubes. So what we need to define now is how the pressure gradient is created. Then we need to find where do the resistances come from. It's a little bit more complex than just blood flow. But we'll go in, we'll use some of the same format for blood flow in both of these. But what we need to do is describe where each one of these comes from. Yesterday we started talking about where this delta P comes from. Everybody take a deep breath in. What's the first thing that had to happen in order for airflow to occur? What was the first thing we discussed yesterday? What's going to start this pressure gradient change? Yeah, great job. Great memory. Yeah, that's right. I said remembery. Deal with it. So the very first thing that we're talking about here, and it's not going to be the first thing that has to happen, by the way. It's actually going to be the second thing that has to happen, which is bizarre. But the second thing that's going to have to happen here is the diaphragm contracts. Well, there are other muscles involved too. So we're going to just write muscular contraction. You and I, we're going to be talking about some of these other muscles that are involved, muscular contraction / relaxation. So we'll go relax. I don't know. That should come across. I just don't have enough room otherwise. So this is actually the second thing that happens. If you all will recall, yesterday I was trying to tell you as we were going through the anatomy of the lungs, I really emphasized how elastic the lungs are. And I said, your lungs are trying to kill you all the time. Yes, no? Why are they trying to kill you? Because your lungs are always trying to collapse. Exactly, Andy. But the good news is they're not collapsing. Why is that? Because the anatomy of the system is going to keep the lungs inflated. So the first thing that has to happen, who cares how much the muscles contract and relax? If the lungs aren't inflated, we can't get any pressure gradients. Does that make sense? We must have our lungs inflated, first and foremost. They must be inflated. And I know that sounds trivial because nobody thinks about the inflation of their lungs. Good. I'm glad we don't have to think about the inflation of our lungs. That would suck. But you guys are officially master physiologists now. Master physiologists. Therefore, you need to know how those lungs stay inflated. All right, so these are going to be the two major things we discussed today. Hopefully we can get through these in record speed. Why did I spell inflation? That's not a word. Here, I'll use a different color so you guys know I'm dumb. Here we go. Inflation. That looks just like the word should. The lungs should be inflated. Okay, let's go to the PowerPoint. So we're talking about the mechanics of breathing, and I hope you guys are starting to get familiar with these sorts of key words. The physical act of breathing, the mechanical act of breathing, the mechanics of breathing. What are we talking about? We're talking about ventilation. Make sense? Do the best you can at tying keywords together. They're not always going to be the exact same keywords, but they'll always have a lot of similarities. And we know that ventilation is all about flow. And in order for flow to happen, we must have a pressure gradient. If you inhale, the environmental pressures will be greater than your lung pressures. If you exhale, your lung pressures will be greater than your environmental pressures. Sweet. How do we create these pressure gradients? We're going to have muscles. Those muscles are going to be changing the gradient as it goes. We'll learn how. What's always opposing airflow? Resistance. And what is the primary factor that we know creates resistance inside of a tube? The diameter of that tube. So a really nice, just, I don't know, review almost at this point slide for y'all. Okay, we're going to be talking about gas exchange 1, which is that basically, gas exchange between the, it's not even gas exchange, basically. We're going to be talking about the air exchange between the atmosphere and the lung, which is ventilation. Okay, breathing in, inhalation, breathing out, exhalation. But the first thing that we must talk about, is it's all for naught. Breathing won't happen if the lungs aren't inflated. End of story. Your lungs must be inflated for proper ventilation. It's crazy difficult to think about lung inflation at first. There's going to be a lot of variables involved. So slow yourself down as you're studying these and really think about the analogies and stuff that I'm about ready to use. How do the lungs stay inflated if they're always trying to collapse? They're going to have elastic recoil. They're constantly pulling inward. They're always a balloon, in essence, that has an empty end, right? A balloon, if you let that balloon go and you didn't tie the end, it's going to recoil and blow all the air out and stay small. Does that make sense? So how do we keep that balloon that doesn't have a tied end, how do we keep that balloon open? Well, part of it has to do with what's called the expanding properties of the chest wall. This is going to make more sense in just a bit. But the body of the thoracic wall is going to be adhered to your lungs. We did briefly mention this yesterday, but I'll go back through it even more detail today. Okay, your thoracic body wall is adhered to your lungs. It's not tied to your lungs. It's not, there's not an anatomical structure that's literally linking the two. There are going to be some pressure gradients and some liquid that's holding it in place. It's crazy. So the last bullet point we're going to have to go through and really discuss by breaking down what each one of these things are. But really, what's truly holding everything open is pressure gradient differences between what's happening inside of the alveoli and between what's happening out in the pleural cavity. Intraalveolar pressure and intrapleural pressure. You might not even need to write anything down right now. If you're just busy scribbling, you're not going to understand all this yet. So let's start talking about each one of these things. But in order to talk about pressure gradients, the first thing you guys need to start to learn about is air pressure. And in order to understand air pressure a little bit, don't freak out. We need to understand a little bit of physics. This is way easier than it looks. So again, don't freak out. Don't look at all the words. Don't try to read all this. This is for later. This is called Dalton's Law. And in fact, I'm going to make it so you don't freak out by getting off of it for a minute. So inflation of the lungs is related to pressure gradients. So in order to understand what is pressure, air pressure, we need to define how we can measure air pressure. So first and foremost, pressures are measured in millimeters of mercury. We know that, right? We know the units for air pressure, for blood pressure, for all pressure is millimeters of mercury. True story? So what is air pressure? What is air pressure? It's different than blood pressure. So what is air pressure? What creates air pressure? Anybody want to guess a gander? Force exerted by air. But what does that even mean, Tariq? You're not wrong, but what does that mean? Yeah, so Heather, you went inside the body, which is awesome. But the answer is no. So you're trying to think about your knowledge about blood, where blood pressure is the force against blood vessel walls. I love your thought process because you're trying to use what you learned before, but that's not what air pressure is, not exactly. It will be pressure that will get applied to the walls of the conduction system, absolutely, but that's not where the pressure comes from. So let me describe this using a simple, yeah, there you go, Becca. It has to do with molecules, and we're just going to use a really, actually, no, not weight of air. So weight of air is gravity. That's not the same thing as pressure. So let's just draw a balloon. All right, so we're going to draw a balloon. Lovely little balloon here. Right, that's a balloon for sure. Or a elephant with its head blowing up. I don't know. Now, what we need to think about is what's going on inside of this balloon. And it's going to be the same thing that's really going on outside of this balloon. But this balloon is going to have air inside of it. And that air, is it all the same molecules? No. Unless you're filling it with pure helium, of course. But then there's not a lot of air pressure. Anywho, molecules inside of a space or in the world around you, they are moving constantly. Did you guys learn that once upon a time in some basic biology course? They're moving, and they're moving randomly. It's just called entropy, right? Molecules are always moving. And molecules are like the assholes at ACL. Like if you're walking by them and they push you back, right? Yeah, it's like, I don't got anywhere else to go here. What do you expect me to do? Stop. Molecules hate each other, and they don't want to be next to each other. They want their own space. And so as molecules are randomly floating around, if they come close to another molecule, they push against that molecule. And as they do, right, it's going to increase, and that doesn't really increase their movement, but they're just always bouncing around, and they just don't stay close to one another at any given time. They're always going to keep a distance or an aura around them. And they also are exerting pressures against the walls. So you're not wrong about that, Heather. They're definitely still exerting forces. Everything that they're bouncing against, they're exerting forces against. Does that make sense? This is the start of air pressure. But what is the air around you made up of? Does anybody know what the number one molecule in the air that you're breathing is? O2, carbon? Any other guesses? Water? I love that you said water. Oh, nitro. I'm guessing by nitro you mean nitrogen. Yeah. I'm not going to pull up a schematic of this or anything, but listen, y'all, this is bizarre. I mean, it's not bizarre. This is a normal semester after semester occurrence. I'm always surprised by the lack of memory. I'm guessing people were taught this somewhere, somehow, but anyways, it doesn't matter. The air around us is primarily nitrogen. Okay, the air around you is exactly what Tariq must have looked up there. It's 78% nitrogen. Most of the air molecules that you're breathing are nitrogen. But nitrogen, yeah, good old Dr. Google. Nitrogen is not something that we can move into our body via a gradient. Nitrogen is very hard to move around. The only way that we can start to move nitrogen into our bloodstream is if the pressures are abnormally high. And this is scuba diving. If you dive too deep and you have to come back up super slow, if anybody's ever heard this, because as you start to dive down, the pressure gradients start to get so great that it forces nitrogen into your bloodstream. And if you make it back to the surface with nitrogen in your bloodstream, you will die. Had a good friend die up in Alaska that way. He was a scientist diving down deep studying sea lions. It happens. Nitrogen. So we don't just have one type of molecule. We have multiple types of molecules. So 78% of the air around you is nitrogen. So what's going on with the rest? The next most abundant molecule in the air around you is oxygen. Okay, oxygen is approximately 21%. It's 20.9, but we're not going to deal with the points. We're going to write 21% of the air around you is oxygen. That's 99% of the air. What's going on with the rest of the air? Well, the rest of the air are those other gases that you were talking about, for sure. Water, definitely in the air around you. Hydrogen's definitely in the air around you, but the concentration or total partial pressure of those is really, really low. The other one we want to think about, though, because we have to think about what's going on in our body. What is our body producing all the time? What do we breathe out? CO2. So we want to think about CO2. We don't want to leave it alone. We want to think about CO2. We're breathing in oxide, not just oxygen here. But this number is stupidly low. This is 0.03% of the air around you, which is great, because what do we know about CO2? Do we want it going into our body? No, we want it going out of our body. Therefore, where do we know CO2 levels are higher? Inside of our body or in the environment around you? Perfect. Not a side note, but a quick side note. Where does the oxygen come from? Where is it coming from? Just want to remind you guys of that. And Andy, what are they using to make oxygen? What do plants use to make the oxygen that we breathe? They use sunlight and CO2. That's it. So they take and convert our shit that would kill us, and they make it into something that we can use. What else is a byproduct? Check this out, y'all. When they take and consume CO2, and they use sunlight to do this, their byproduct is oxygen, and they're also making tons of sugars, starches. Anyways, it's a really cool, remember, the world is synergistic. Just don't ever forget that. If you don't forget that, then you'll understand physiology. Well, I mean, it's a circle of life. There's nothing wrong with killing them. It's just a matter of, let's think about where our oxygen comes from. Let's think about what is a great reducer of CO2 and CO. So that's it. That's all. And I'm not going anywhere else besides that. Everybody else gets to make their own decisions in life. That's what makes this place so damn cool. I'll just give you guys some of that physiology there and some of the science behind it. It's really cool. So now we're starting to think about this air balloon. I need to get back on track. Now we start thinking about this air balloon. We think that most of the molecules in here are nitrogen, but there are other molecules in here. Yeah? But they are also exerting pressures. There are other molecules in here. Not very many of them, but they're also exerting pressures. Well, each one of these is going to exert the individual pressure. Oxygen exerts its pressure, nitrogen exerts its pressure, carbon dioxide exerts its pressure. And there is this scientist named Dalton who basically said, I need to try to come up with a way to measure pressures in the world around us. And he started going into what is the composition of air. And he was one of the first originators of this, studies behind the composition of air. He also went down to sea level. He took a barometer with him and he measured the total pressure in the air around him. The total pressure in the air around him, the total pressure in the atmosphere. And he called this atmospheric pressure. Atmospheric pressure. ATM, not what you're throwing your money into. ATM is just atmospheric. And we're just going to use a capital P for pressure. This ain't dollar bill because most people's ATMs are, pretty empty. So ATM, P, atmospheric pressure. Is that clear what this stands for, ATMP? All this dude did was he went down to the beach, probably on vacation somewhere, and brought a barometer with him and used that as an excuse to, get a grant money or something like that on vacation, chilling. And he was able to measure what is the pressure of the air at sea level on a beautiful sunny day. And what he found is that the atmospheric pressure is approximately 760 millimeters of mercury. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. You got a machine, basically, you got a barometer that's doing this reading for you. However many millimeters of mercury, literally it was a tube, right? With mercury inside of it, and the more pressure put on that mercury, it moved up millimeters. Millimeters of mercury. It's not, that's where that unit comes from. How many millimeters did my mercury move? Old school barometers. Well, then he said, well, if the total composition of the air around you is 760 millimeters of mercury, and the air is made up of 78% nitrogen, then 78% of 760 millimeters of mercury is going to be the pressures that are being exerted by nitrogen. Does that make sense? Total atmospheric pressure 760. The air is 78% nitrogen, so there's a ton of the pressure coming from nitrogen. Well, here's the deal. We don't care in normal physiological situations about nitrogen pressures because nitrogen is stubborn. I like it. You wrote that up there. I don't remember who it was, but it is. It doesn't want to go into our body. What does? Oxygen and CO2. So let's go ahead and focus on those two things. So what we want to start thinking about is the partial pressure. This is called partial pressure. Partial pressure is taking whatever the subset is of the total pressure. Partial pressure of oxygen, for instance, would be just the pressure exerted by oxygen in the air around you. And we're going to be able to take, and we'll subset this. So for instance, if we're looking at the partial pressure of atmospheric oxygen, we do a capital P and a subset O2. So this tells us atmospheric partial pressure of oxygen. Make sense? And if you go and do the math, 760 millimeters of mercury, you take 21% of 760 millimeters of mercury, what you end up with is approximately 160 millimeters of mercury. It's actually 159, but again, we're not going to be counting hairs here. We're just going to say 160 millimeters of mercury, and that's good enough for me. So if on a test or on a diagram or on a drawing, I ask you guys, what is the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere around us? What are you guys going to say? You must know this number, you must know this number, you must know this number. Memorize it, or memorize 760 if you have to go that route, but then you got to memorize a whole bunch of numbers and do some math. Just memorize this number. Atmospheric partial pressure of oxygen, 160 millimeters of mercury. Okay? Get a tattoo? Not really. Right in the middle of your forehead. You'll never forget. All right, let's get rolling. Let's get rolling. And that's literally what this tells you. Everything on this slide, you're at sea level, atmospheric pressure 760 millimeters mercury, but there's 20% of the air that is oxygen. So what do? We take 760 millimeters of mercury, we take 21% of that 760, and we get 160. If we do the same thing for carbon dioxide and water in the air around you and nitrogen, then we can get the partial pressures for each one of those. But all we really care about is what's going on with oxygen and carbon dioxide. These values change depending on where you're at and what temperature the world is around you. For instance, if you're in Austin, Texas, and it's 100 degrees out, 37 degrees C is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and you're at 100% humidity, okay, more like Houston. Well, look at what happens to the partial pressure of oxygen. This is why people are a lot more mean when they're hot, because their body's not getting as much oxygen anymore. We'll deal with that. It has to do with pressure gradients, and we're going to have less of a pressure gradient. We lose 10 millimeters of mercury. Carbon dioxide. Since carbon dioxide is only 0.03% of the air around us, if you do the math on that, look at the millimeters of mercury. 0.25. So let's go ahead and fill that out in our chart. So we would end up saying atmospheric partial pressure of CO2 equals 0.025, right? Very small. I can't remember which one it was. 0.0? I don't know. Just 0.25. Still very small. Here, we'll go 0.25. It's that small. That's not typically correct there with that extra zero. All right, cool. Why is this important? Because what we need to move into is how the lung stays inflated. And that lung stays inflated due to pressure gradients. So you got to understand what pressures even are before you can really start to understand pressure gradients. Is that clear? Somewhat. So let's take a lung. Oh, we're not doing this yet. Let's take a lung and let's make a schematic that we can understand. That's simple to draw, that's replicatable. And that's what this drawing right here is. Okay, so in essence, this is all of the airways of that respiratory system, all of them. Nose, nasal cavity, pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, bronchioles. Every single airway is just represented by this tube, okay? And it's gonna dive down into a lung. The pink here is a representation of all of the alveoli, all of them. Not one. This is not one alveolus. This is all the alveoli. Does that make sense? We're trying to get a depiction that we can use. This other pink color, tan, peach, I don't know what the hell color. I'm kind of partially colorblind. My bad. This out here is the wall of the thorax. So this is, you know, where the ribs and stuff would be. We'll talk about what all that blue stuff is in the middle, but pleural cavity, right? We'll come back to that. So the way we draw this is I just draw a tube. Give me some space here. I just draw my tube down. There's my representation of all of the tubes going in and out of that respiratory system. And I'm just going to take, and using the same color because it's easier, I'm just going to draw a circle. Well, my representation of a circle. Although this one's coming out almost circular. Oh, I messed up that side. Whatever. Now, outside of this, I'm going to draw my thoracic cavity. So this one right here is my lung. These are all my alveoli. Out here, I'm going to draw my thoracic cavity. And I want to leave a lot of space in between my lung and my thoracic cavity, just so we can label things a little better. Whatever, they're circular. So again, this is my thoracic cavity, not cavity, sorry, my thoracic wall. Technically, it would be the cavity wall, but we're going to call it the wall. Ribs, muscles, that sort of stuff. In here, those are my lungs. All right, cool. Now for the serous membranes, which I started to emphasize pretty strongly yesterday. But serous membranes are a big part of this physiology that you guys are trying to learn. There is a serous membrane that wraps itself all the way. It's actually connected, right? Imagine a serous membrane being a flat, I don't know, a balloon, right? It's a balloon, but then you stick your hand down in that balloon. You're going to have some of that balloon that is in direct contact with your hand, but you're also going to have balloon on the outside of that that's not in contact with your hand. Does that make sense? It's the way I think about serous membranes. Just take a balloon and stick your hand all the way down in the middle of it. This would be the hand, the lungs right here. You're still in contact with that entire balloon because that balloon membrane is all connected. But the balloon membrane that is in direct contact with that organ what do we call this? Do we call this visceral? Do we call it parietal? Do we call it I don't care about this thing? This is visceral. And since we're dealing with the lungs, we're talking about pleura. This is the visceral pleura. Now, there's also a section of this that is now going to be bound to that thoracic cavity wall. And what is this that I'm drawing in right now? Good. So all that is the parietal pleura. Parietal pleura. Oh, that's parietal pleura. Sweet. Now, there's a space in between the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura, and this is the pleural cavity. In this pleural cavity, since it's the space in between two serous membranes, something that makes serous membranes unique is the secretion of serous fluid. So this pleural cavity filled with serous fluid. Everybody feel pretty comfortable with what just got put on here? Sweet. You know, this is kind of drawn out, obviously, out of what's the word when it's not in the? This is not a real lung. So the pleural cavity space that I'm drawing in, I drew it bigger than it really is, right? The parietal pleura and the visceral pleura, they're a little bit closer together, and there's fluid in between. And as I've taught you earlier this semester, two membranes with fluid in between will stick to one another. That's going to be one of the starts to how this lung stays inflated. Because there's fluid here in that pleural cavity, this creates surface tension. That surface tension, it plays a small role. It plays a role. Without the surface tension, your lungs would collapse. But there's going to be something else that has to come into play as well. So one of the things that helps keep those lungs inflated is the fact that there is surface tension between the lungs and the thoracic wall. But what did we say about those lungs? Is they are always trying to what? These lungs are always trying to collapse. Always. Pretty crazy. They're trying to move this way. And they have a lot of elastic fibers that are wrapped around them to help with that function. They're trying to collapse. A little bit of surface tension alone is not enough to keep your lungs attached to that thoracic wall. We need more pressure. We need more cowbell. Not everybody knows that reference, I found through the years. It's a really funny reference. Andy got it. It's, Saturday Night Live, Will Ferrell, one of his original skits. I'm classic, total classic. How do we go about doing this? All right, now let's talk about pressures. So out here is the atmosphere. And what is the total pressure in the atmosphere around us? What did I say? You guys should write down when I ask you. What is the total atmospheric pressure? 760 millimeters of mercury. Awesome. That's out here in the atmosphere. Now, we have a tube that's connecting the atmosphere to the inside of our lungs. This in here is called intra-alveolar or intra-pulmonary, but since we're talking about all of the alveoli, we're going to be discussing this as alveolar. Sometimes I'll say the word intrapulmonary, same idea. Intraalveolar, intrapulmonary, we're kind of discussing the same thing. Intraalveolar pressures. It's the pressure inside of all the alveoli of the body. Well, if these two things are connected, assuming everything else is constant, what do we know about airflow? Air is always going to flow from high to low until when? When is air going to stop flowing? There are many times that air stops flowing. Yeah, equilibrium. When delta P is 0, when we're at an equilibrium, there's no airflow. Does that make sense, everybody? So let's start there, because at rest, your intraalveolar pressure is at equilibrium. So what does that tell you? Because I have a tube that's connecting these two things, air can flow in, air can flow out. So at rest, the intraalveolar pressure is going to be what? If it's at equilibrium, we don't have any airflow right now. What's the intraalveolar pressure going to be? 760 millimeters of mercury. Beautiful. Does that make sense to everybody? All right. So now, what I need to teach you guys about is something called Boyle's Law. We'll end up writing that Boyle's Law right here. So the next step in this is understanding a little bit more physics. Not too much more physics, I promise. This isn't too crazy. Can be if students try to just go read about it. But the reason why it can be confusing is because people read the word law, they freak out. They see a math equation, they freak out. Boyle's law is P1 V1 equals P2 V2, and people are like, nope, no thanks, nope, nope, no, I'm done. Pressure in a chamber and volume in that chamber. So let's draw a chamber. That's how we're going to get started here. Doesn't matter what this chamber is, but we're going to have, I don't know, we're going to have a pressure cooker. Why not? You know, we can put a little lid on top, I don't know, a handle. There's that steam outlet right there. Deal with it. There's steam leaving. No, we want to close that. We want a completely closed off top of my lid, okay? In this pot, I have a specific volume. Does that make sense? In this pot, I have a very, very specific volume. This is called V1. It's the volume of pot 1. And what did we learn about pressures? Pressures are all about molecules. So if I have molecules inside of this pot, these molecules are exerting a very specific pressure because they have entropy and they're moving around. True story? And they can't get out. They're completely trapped in here. So the pressure in this pot is very specific to the volume of this pot. Why is that? Because if I take this pot, this exact same pot, God, can I even come close to drawing the same thing? I know it doesn't look like much. This takes so much focus on my part. All right, if I take this exact same pot, but now what I do is I move the lid down. What just happened to the volume of this pot? Increase, decrease, no change. No. I moved the lid down, Tariq. Maybe you didn't hear me say that. So the lid just got moved down. So now the volume of this pot, all we're looking at is this area under the curve. So increase, decrease, no change. The volume of the pot just decreased. Now we have another very specific volume, V2. But what happened to the number of molecules inside of this chamber? All I did was I moved the lid down. So the number of molecules inside of this chamber stayed the same. But again, ACL is a great analogy of this, because this is like as the day goes on, you know, assuming that the number of people all stay the same, but then, you know, you get those big artists up on stage and the entire crowd starts to get closer and closer and closer together. And you start feeling more and more crowded. If I had the same number of molecules in a smaller space, what just happened to the pressure inside of that system? So the pressure in this particular pot just got bigger as the volume just got smaller. You guys don't need to do all the math behind this, but it's really as easy as if I decrease the volume by 1/2, then the pressure is going to increase twofold. They're just inversely related, exactly inversely related. It's a really easy physics math stuff, but you guys don't need to do that. What do we see here? Are these guys directly related, directly proportional, or are they inversely proportional to one another? There. Now you guys feel like you understand this hopefully a little bit better, but when I really get down to the nitty-gritty of this, what do we know about the pressure in the system? Is it's inversely related to the volume in that system. As volume increases, what happens to the pressure in that system? Increase, decrease, no change. If that volume increases, then the pressure decreases. What happens if the volume decreases? What happens to the pressure in that system? Everybody breathe in. What just happened to your thoracic cavity volume? Increase, decrease, no change. So what just happened to your lung volume? No, you just jumped it, Tariq. You love to do that. What happens to your lung volume? Please remember, thoracic cavity and lungs are two different things. The lungs are inflated, and therefore, as the thoracic cavity volume increases, the lungs will increase in volume with it. So what just happened to the pressure inside of your lungs? Increase, decrease, no change. And what do we know about pressure gradients? Air in the world around us is always trying to go from, maybe when you guys look at the weather from here on out, you'll understand why weather moves and why, you know, we get blowing of wind and stuff, right? What is wind? It's literally just air trying to move from an area of high to low in the universe around us. Universe, I guess we shouldn't say universe, but in our world, in our atmosphere. Pretty cool. So, since our volume increased and our pressure decreases, yeah, the whole universe is moving high to low. that pressure just decreased inside of your chest cavity. And we just said air likes to move from high to low, and air is going to flow from the atmosphere into our lungs. Congratulations, you just learned all about breathing. There's more to it with inflation and everything, but that's literally all breathing is changing pressure gradients by changing the volume. Breathe out. What just happened to your thoracic cavity volume? Increase, decrease, no change. Therefore, what just happened to the pressure in that side of that system? Increase, decrease, no change. Therefore, air is going to move from high to low, so it leaves your thoracic cavity out into the atmosphere around you. Pretty cool, huh? But what's that got to do with this? What's that got to do with the inflation of the lungs? It's got everything to do with the inflation of the lungs. Oh, huge part of Boyle's Law. Huge part. Gosh, I can't believe I mentioned it earlier, but I didn't write it down and I didn't really emphasize this, is that Boyle's Law only fully applies to a closed system. Closed system. Closed system means that it is not open to the environment. It can't have leaks. Exactly, Tariq. If it has a leak, it's going to try to follow Boyle's Law, but eventually it's going to equalize back to its original pressure. If it has a leak, like a conduction system, when the pressure gradient stops, everything is equal because there's a leak here. Yes, no, maybe so? So just because pressures are going to change, they're going to eventually equalize because of the connection between the atmosphere and the intraalveoli. However, where is there not a connection between the atmosphere and pressure somewhere in here? The pleural cavity. The pleural cavity follows Boyle's Law completely because the pleural cavity is completely closed off from the atmosphere. Does that make sense? This is a closed system, which makes it unique from what's happening inside of the alveoli. If your lungs are always trying to collapse, then the lungs are always trying to move away from their surface tension. Does that make sense? They're always trying to move away from the thoracic wall. This is an important step. Did everybody understand that? If the lungs are always trying to collapse, then they're always trying to move away from the thoracic wall. So what's going to be happening? What's an analogy for that? Let's just take and draw two lines. 1, 2 lines. This would be the thorax over here, and this over here would be the lungs. Right? So if we start in this position, but the lungs are trying to be elastic, they're trying to move away from the thoracic wall. Does that make sense? And therefore, if it moves away, which it will because it's elastic, what just happened to the distance between the lung and the thoracic wall? Increase, decrease, no change. Good. That's actually helpful. I've never done this drawing before, but that should make sense. I'm like, that's actually, well, no, nothing about permeability right now, Tariq. No, sir. Don't think about that. No, get that off your mind. We're not talking about permeability. We have pleural cavity. This is not where diffusion occurs. This is not where diffusion occurs. This is just where inflation occurs. Okay, so what do we see going on here then? If the lungs are always trying to collapse, what's going to be happening to the volume of the pleural cavity relative to if the lungs were not trying to collapse? Don't think about serous fluid. Nothing to do with serous fluid movement either. Just pay attention to the words that I'm trying to say. If the lungs are always trying to collapse, what's going to be happening to the volume in this pleural cavity space. Increase, decrease, no change. Okay, and as long as I got one decrease thrown in there, I want to make sure that I explain this better. The lungs are trying to move away from the thoracic cavity wall. So originally we have this space right here, whatever, arbitrarily this is 2. It doesn't matter what number I use. Now the lungs are collapsing ever so slightly. They have moved away from the thoracic cavity wall, and therefore this distance between the thorax and the lungs just got bigger. So the volume inside of this space just got bigger. Does that make sense? Awesome. It's an important step to think about, because if the volume gets bigger and it is a closed system, then it perfectly follows Boyle's law. And in Boyle's law, pressure is inversely related to volume. Here in this pleural cavity, the volume is trying to increase because the lungs are trying to collapse. Does that make sense? So, pleural cavity, the volume relative to if there was no elastic fibers, the volume is going to be relatively high. So what do we know about the pressures inside of this system? Are they going to be relatively high or relatively low? Yeah, increase, decrease, no change. Perfect. The pressures inside of this system here is called the intrapleural pressure. I'm trying to figure out where I'm going to write this, I guess over here. Intrapleural pressure. That's what's going on inside of this system. There is a pressure. It started at 760. You don't need to know how. That all happens during embryonic development. Okay, it starts at 760 because it's going to be equalized with the world around you. And when the lungs inflate, they're not inflated until you're born. They're not fully inflated and perfectly working until you're born. Now, that intrapleural pressure is going to be created at 760, but the volume is going to increase as the lungs try to collapse, so the pressures in this system are going to decrease. And they're going, you don't need to know exactly, the physics behind that. If you're taking another, medical physics class, they'll probably end up teaching you it, but it's going to end up at about 756 millimeters of mercury. This is all due to Boyle's law. Because the lungs are elastic, the volume inside the pleural cavity space is going to be slightly bigger than it would be otherwise, decreasing the pressures in that system. Yeah, 4 millimeters of mercury is quite a bit in a system like this. That's, it's hard to relate it to anything because you guys don't have anything to relate it to probably. But I'm going to try to give you something to relate it to in just a minute. So this is atmospheric pressure, 760 millimeters of mercury. Is the intrapleural pressure above or below atmospheric pressure? Dumb question, I know, but nonetheless, I'm asking it. So 756, is that above or below? And so what we call this is subatmospheric pressure. 756 millimeters of mercury is subatmospheric pressure. All right, last but not least, where is everything in this universe trying to go? From an area of? Aha. So now we have a subatmospheric pressure in here. Where is this 760 millimeters of mercury going to try to go? Well, now it gets to push back as it tries to go to that 756, but can't because it's a closed system. This is a vacuum. All vacuums that you've been using through your life create subatmospheric pressures. That's how they work. Therefore, everything in the atmosphere around it tries to get sucked towards that subatmospheric pressure. So now we've created a subatmospheric pressure inside of our intrapleural cavity, and that's going to make it so the lungs are drawn to the thoracic wall in a vacuum. How cool is that? Convoluted, but super cool. We create a vacuum, and your lungs get sucked to that vacuum. No matter that they're trying to collapse or not, those lungs are going to get sucked to that and adhere to that vacuum. They're going to be held in place for your entire life because that vacuum doesn't get lost. What if that vacuum does get lost? So that's what we'll do. We'll come back here. All those same things that I just talked about, right? Where we got an intraalveolar pressure, an intrapleural pressure. So what would happen now if we took, and we create a hole right here that exposes the pleural cavity to the atmosphere around it? What's going to happen? Where does air want to be? Yeah, well, let's be more specific. You're not wrong, Andy, but let's be even more specific than that. What's going to happen to the intrapleural pressure? Do we still have Boyle's law? Do we still have a closed system, y'all? No. And everything in the universe is going to try to go from high to low. And out here was 760 millimeters of mercury. Okay, well, now this 760 is going to do what? That 760 is going to rush through that hole into that intrapleural cavity, equalizing that. So what just happened to the vacuum that had been holding your lungs inflated your entire life? We lost the vacuum. The second this happens, your lungs will collapse. This is called a pneumothorax, and we've got a slide for it in a little bit. But that's how pneumothoraxes occur. You can either have a pneumothorax that occurs because this is actually, I think that I looked this up not too long ago, but I can't remember exactly. I think this is the #1 injury in military. I think military medics are treating pneumothoraxes quite often. This also occurs, we'll talk about this more, but a lot in car accidents and stuff like that, gunshot wounds. Moving this whole thing. Pneumothorax from the outside. Now, let's think about it the other way. What if there is a hole that occurs between your alveoli and that intrapleural cavity? Is it going to be any different? Still got 760 on the inside. We still have things going from high to low. Therefore, the 760 inside of the lungs is going to move to that intrapleural cavity. We lose the vacuum and the lung collapses. Does that make sense? Actually, the #1 way that this might occur, right? The ribs are ever outward expanding, especially try to breathe in. Right? Your ribs, your thoracic cavity just expanded, and think about pulling, stretching even tighter on a rubber band. What just happened to the want, the need of that rubber band to recoil? The longer you pull that rubber band, what's going to happen to the pressures? Yeah, they're going to increase, right? So the lungs are trying to recoil even more the bigger the breath you take, which of course is going to start to change that intrapleural cavity space. But now we get shanked in prison. I wish this was a toothbrush. That'd be great. Joking, kind of. But air from the atmosphere just made it into that pleural cavity. 760 equalizes with 760. And that lung loses its vacuum and it collapses. This is a pneumothorax for those that didn't know how to spell that word before. What do we know about pneumothoraxes? That pneumothorax can either occur on the outside. This is normally due to trauma, damage, car accidents, gunshot wounds, shrapnel, or falling out of trees, or we can have spontaneous pneumothorax, which occurs on the inside. This normally occurs due to, well, there's lots of things, but like emphysema or lung cancer, that sort of stuff. Car accidents can actually weaken the lining on the inside. Really, really tall people, astronauts, yeah, depends on pressure gradients. Really, really tall people will get spontaneous pneumothoraxes because of the size, the sheer size and volume of their lungs. No bueno. So just a real quick thought process. How do we fix this? It's actually not too hard. We fix this. How? What happened that broke this? We lost the pressure gradient. We lost Boyle's law. True story? Exactly, Ashley. Good. So what do we need to do? First and foremost is we need to close that system back down. We need to put some sort of patch over that puncture. Much harder on a spontaneous pneumothorax. On a traumatic pneumothorax, we can put a patch right there. But does that immediately fix the pressure gradient problems? We just had atmospheric pressure rush into this. No, it doesn't repressurize on its own. Great question. That's where I was going next, right? This is not going to just repressurize. So the next thing we need to do is what? Add more pressure to the system or take pressure away from the system. Is this making sense to everybody? So they actually just insert a needle. They have these pneumothorax needles that they can use that literally are going to equalize, draws pressure out. Or you can just put in a needle with a syringe, pop that down into that. The pleural cavity space is going to be huge right now. So you don't really need to worry about puncturing the lung. And you just need to draw some of that air out. And if you draw air out, you're releasing the pressure. The pressure inside that system is going to drop, and then that lung is just going to magically readhere. It's really cool. Yeah, when you look it up online, there are some really good YouTube videos and stuff on how to repair pneumothorax and animated and stuff like that. Yeah, it's super cool. Super duper cool. All right, cool. Now, quickly now, I love this little picture. We have now inflated the lungs. Took a while, didn't it? I told you inflation of the lungs is one of the more difficult things to understand. But we must have inflation or breathing can't occur. You can contract your muscles all you want, but if that lung is not inflated, then you can't breathe. Is that clear? So make sure you guys understand the differences in these pressure gradients. There's a summary slide right here. The lung and the thoracic cavity in apposition, which means they're working together. It's not opposition, it's apposition. They're working together to get stuff done. How do they work together? Surface tensions and these what's called transmural pressure gradients, which have to do the differences between the intraalveolar pressure and the intrapleural pressure, creating a subatmospheric pressure. That subatmospheric pressure isn't just magic, right? It has to do with the elastic recoil of the lungs versus the surface tension holding on to those lungs. It's crazy, it's complex. What if the lungs start losing elasticity? Shit. There's lots of different pulmonary fibrotic lung diseases out there where the elastic fibers start turning into collagen fibers. collagen fibers and elastic. So yeah, we won't get too much into the pathos, but there's a lot of them out there. Okay, but now that we have inflation, now we can start working the pump. There's a muscular pump that comes into play. Muscles are going to contract and muscles are going to relax. So for tomorrow's lecture, do me a favor. This can go super fast or this can go super slow. It all depends on you and how much you guys are studying ahead. But let's think about ventilation and what muscles are involved. Lots of them. Focus on the ones with the pink arrows. But look at all of these muscles and try to remind yourselves which ones you learned about in A&P 1. And last but not least, everybody take a deep breath in. What do you know all the muscles of inhalation are going to do to your thoracic cavity volume? Increase, decrease, no change. Again, what do you know all of the muscles of inhalation are going to be doing to your thoracic cavity volume? Increase, decrease, no change. Inhale. Everybody breathe in. What just happened to your thoracic cavity volume? Increase, decrease, no change. So the idea, the logic behind the muscles you just contracted. Actually, let's do this real quick. I know it's 20 after. I'm finishing. I promise. Breathe in. Keep going. Keep going. Do you feel how you started to recruit more and more muscles the more you breathe in? Did you guys start to feel your neck tighten? Your neck muscles are tightening, for Pete's sake. These are your sternocleidomastoids. Most people remember the sternocleidomastoids from A&P 1, right? They're attached to your sternum and your mastoid process up above. These are involved in breathing. They're also involved in shrugging and moving your neck, but they're definitely involved in breathing too. And what did you just learn? If you contract the sternocleidomastoid, what's it going to do to your thoracic cavity volume? Increase, decrease, no change. Boom. Everybody breathe out. Keep going. What's happening to your thoracic cavity volume as you breathe out? Decrease. Keep going. Keep breathing out. Keep going. What muscles are you feeling getting super engaged right now? Keep going. Diaphragm, sure, absolutely. Diaphragm's always involved. Keep going then, Andy. If you haven't gotten to the rest yet, you got to keep breathing out. Keep going. Abdominal muscles. You guys feeling those abs crunching down? Those abs. Those abdominal muscles are really, really involved in exhalation. So what do you know they're going to help do? Yes, the abdominal muscles are down here, but they can still, as they contract and crunch down the system, what are they going to be doing to the volume of the thoracic cavity? Increase, decrease, no change. And if you've ever done exercises before, like stomach crunches or whatever, any exercise that uses your core, which is pretty much all your exercises, what do they tell you to do? Especially as you're doing crunches and you're going to tighten your abdominal muscles, they tell you to breathe out at the same time. Okay? Why? It's not so that you breathe better. It's not about oxygen in, oxygen out. It has to do with contracting those muscles, strengthening your core at the right time. It's at the right time. If you try to breathe in at the same time as you contract your abdominal muscles, it's counterintuitive. It's not what your body wants to do. All right, cool. Boyle's Law. Muscles are all about Boyle's Law. Okay, adios, peace. I don't want to keep you guys forever today. Tomorrow we will continue our discussion of this, but it can go crazy fast if you guys understand that muscles are involved in changing the volume. If you guys have any questions, let me know, and I will see you tomorrow.